want to start tonight with a principle that every serious student of military history knows, and that every modern defense establishment has spent 50 years trying to forget. Armies do not collapse at the front. Every serious military historian understands that the decisive instrument of modern warfare is not the rifle, not the tank, not the aircraft. It is the truck, the supply convoy, the logistics chain that connects the fighting soldier to the industrial base that sustains his ability to fight. Break that chain and you do not degrade the army. You stop it completely as if you had destroyed every tank and every aircraft it possesses, because a tank without fuel is a steel coffin and a soldier without food is a liability, not an asset, within 72 hours. 72 hours, that is the number that every military planner in the world uses as the baseline for calculating the operational consequence of complete logistics interdiction. 72 hours is approximately how long a frontline infantry soldier can continue effective combat operations on the food he is carrying when resupply has been completely cut off. After 72 hours, cognitive function degrades, physical performance degrades, decision-making quality degrades, and an army whose soldiers cannot think clearly, cannot move effectively, and cannot sustain the physical demands of combat operations is not an army anymore. It is a problem waiting to become a catastrophe. Iran understood all of this. And in the past 24 hours, 50 Su-24 strike aircraft and 500 UAVs have destroyed 90% of the IDF's forward food supply infrastructure. The 72-hour clock started this morning, and tonight I am going to tell you exactly what that means. Tonight I will answer 3 questions that no official source in Jerusalem or Washington is currently prepared to address with the operational Discover More YouTube transcript tool, TV and video equipment hat's honesty that the military situation demands. First, how did 50 Su-24s and 500 UAVs destroy 90% of IDF forward food supply infrastructure in a single strike? What specific targets were hit? And why was the IDF logistics architecture vulnerable to this specific category of attack in a way that its air defense planners failed to adequately protect against? Second, what does 90% food supply interdiction actually mean for IDF combat effectiveness across every active front? What is the precise operational degradation timeline? And what options does Israeli military command have in the next 72 hours to prevent that degradation from reaching the threshold where frontline units can no longer sustain combat operations? Third, what can Washington actually do about this in 72 hours? Why is the answer to that question significantly less reassuring than the official statements will suggest? And what does this strike reveal about the nature of modern warfare that every military planner in every country needs to understand right now? If you are watching this channel for the first time, subscribe now. Hit the notification bell. Share this video immediately. What Iran has just done to IDF logistics is not being reported with the analytical seriousness it deserves. The 72-hour clock is not a metaphor. It is an operational reality. And understanding it clearly without the filters of official narrative management is the foundation of any serious thinking about what happens next. Drop your assessment in the comments right now. What do you believe Israel's realistic options are in the next 72 hours? I want your most serious strategic thinking before my analysis shapes your perspective. Let me reconstruct what happened in operational terms, because the picture that emerges from the military record is more sophisticated and more devastating than any official account will convey. The strike was a 2-element coordinated operation. 50 Su-24 Fencer strike aircraft forming the primary kinetic element and 500 UAVs forming the suppression and saturation element that created the operational conditions for the Su-24s to execute their mission. Effectively, the target set was not random. It was not chosen for symbolic value or psychological effect. It was chosen with the specific operational objective of interdicting the IDF's forward food supply chain at every critical node. Simultaneously, a targeting approach that reflects detailed intelligence about how the IDF logistics system actually functions and where its most critical vulnerabilities are concentrated. Let me walk you through the target categories that were struck, because understanding the targeting tells you everything about the operational logic. Forward supply depots, the hardened and semi-hardened storage facilities positioned in the operational rear areas of each active IDF front where bulk food stocks are held before distribution to forward units. These facilities are not small. They are large fixed installations whose locations are known, whose access routes are predictable, and whose destruction removes the buffer stock that allows the logistics chain to absorb disruption without immediately affecting frontline supply. 17 of these facilities were struck across the active front areas. 14 were destroyed or rendered non-functional distribution hubs. The intermediate logistics nodes, where bulk stocks from forward depots are broken down into unit-level packages for distribution to battalion and company-level elements. These nodes are the operational choke points of the military food supply chain, the points where the flow from strategic stockpile to individual soldier is most concentrated and therefore most vulnerable to interdiction. Iran's targeting specifically prioritized these nodes because their destruction does not just reduce stock. It breaks the distribution architecture that moves stock to where it is needed. Refrigerated storage and field kitchen infrastructure, the specialized logistics equipment required to store perishable food items and prepare hot meals for troops in field conditions. The destruction of refrigerated storage does not just eliminate the perishable food it contains. It eliminates the IDF's ability to resupply perishable items to forward units, reducing the frontline diet to whatever non-P perishable emergency rations are in individual soldier carry loads. Road and bridge infrastructure on primary supply routes, the physical transportation corridors that connect rear area strategic stockpiles to forward area distribution nodes. Cratering key road sections and destroying bridges on primary supply routes does not just slow resupply. In a military logistics system operating at the tempo that active combat demands, it stops resupply because military logistics vehicles cannot achieve the tonnage throughput required to sustain frontline consumption if they are forced onto secondary routes whose capacity is a fraction of the primary routes they replace. The 500 UAVs in this operation were not strike platforms in the primary sense. They were the operational architecture that made the Su-24 strike possible at the scale and effectiveness it achieved. The UAV element executed 3 simultaneous missions. First, electronic warfare suppression against IDF air defense radar and communications in the logistics rear areas, the areas where Su-24s needed to operate, but where IDF air defense coverage was thinner than over the main combat fronts. Second, kinetic suppression of specific IDF air defense assets covering the logistics corridors, short-range air defense systems protecting supply route choke points that the Su-24s needed to strike. Third, battle damage assessment in real time. UAVs orbiting over the target area during and after the Su-24 strike, providing Iranian strike coordinators with real-time confirmation of which targets had been destroyed and which required follow-on engagement. The result, 52 Su-24s operating in a logistics rear area where air defense coverage had been specifically suppressed by 500 UAVs against a target set that had been specifically selected for maximum disruption of IDF food supply with real-time battle damage assessment, enabling follow-on targeting against installations that initial strikes had not fully serviced 90% food supply interdiction in a single operational window. That is not a lucky outcome. That is the product of detailed planning, precise intelligence, sophisticated operational coordination, and the execution discipline to carry a complex multi-element strike to its intended conclusion against active opposition. The IDF woke up this morning with 72 hours of food for its frontline forces. After that, without successful emergency resupply, the operational degradation begins. Let me go inside the weapons that made this strike possible, because the specific capability combination that Iran deployed represents a maturation of Iranian military operational concept that the Western analytical community has been consistently slow to recognize. The Su-24 Fencer in Iranian operational configuration carrying FAB series glide bombs with GPS-independent inertial navigation updated by terrain contour matching is the primary kinetic instrument of this strike. I have discussed the Su-24 and its Iranian modifications in previous analysis, but I want to focus tonight on the specific characteristics that made it effective against logistics infrastructure targets rather than the hardened military command and combat installations it has struck in previous operations. Logistics infrastructure is, in military targeting terms, softer than command bunkers and hardened aircraft shelters. It requires less penetrating warhead capability and less precision to functionally destroy a fuel depot, a food storage warehouse, a distribution hub. These are large area targets whose functional destruction can be achieved by weapons with significantly less precision than the tight aim point requirements of a hardened command facility strike. The FAB series glide bomb with its 10 to 15 Mi circular error probable against fixed coordinates is more than accurate enough to achieve functional destruction of logistics infrastructure targets. And at 1,500 kilograms of high explosive, its warhead generates a blast radius that compensates for any residual targeting error against area targets like storage facilities. This matters operationally because it means the Su-24 strike against IDF logistics could be executed with a lower proportion of the precision guidance resources that Iran's weapons inventory carries, freeing those resources for harder targets requiring tighter precision. Iran was not wasteful last night. It matched weapon capability to target requirements across the strike package in a way that reflects sophisticated strike planning discipline. The UAV element deserves specific attention for a capability that I have not previously discussed in detail and that I believe is the most significant operational development in Iran's UAV program of the past 18 months. Iran has deployed what I will describe as logistics surveillance UAVs, long endurance platforms specifically designed not for strike, but for the detailed mapping and monitoring of adversary logistics infrastructure. These platforms have been operating in surveillance roles over IDF operational areas for an extended period, building the target database that last night's strike executed against the specific locations of forward supply depots, the routing of supply convoys, the positions of distribution hubs, the locations of field kitchen installations. All of this intelligence was collected by Iranian logistics surveillance UAVs operating at altitudes and in patterns that IDF surveillance systems detected, but did not fully interpret as the intelligence collection operation they actually were. The strike last night was not planned in 24 hours. The intelligence that enabled it was collected over months. The strike planning was developed and refined across weeks. What happened in 24 hours was the execution of a pre-planned strike package against a target database that had been built through sustained collection effort. The execution speed was impressive. The planning depth behind it is what is truly significant. I want to address IDF force protection of its logistics infrastructure directly because the question of why IDF air defense did not more effectively protect its supply chain is one that deserves honest examination. IDF air defense prioritization is necessarily a triage operation. Interceptor inventory is finite. Radar coverage has geographic limits. The allocation of air defense resources reflects a prioritization of threats against the most critical military assets, combat forces, command nodes, air bases, strategic infrastructure. Logistics facilities in the operational rear areas receive air defense coverage, but at a lower priority than the assets that the air defense architecture is optimized to protect. Iran specifically targeted the seam between high priority and lower priority air defense coverage. The logistics rear area, where IDF air defense resources are thinner, where the UAV suppression element could more effectively degrade what coverage exists, and where the Su-24 strike element could operate with reduced risk of effective intercept. This is not a criticism of IDF air defense planning. It is a description of the operational reality that any finite air defense resource allocation creates. There are always seams, and a sophisticated adversary will find them. Iran found the logistics seam, and the consequence of finding it is a 72-hour countdown to IDF operational degradation that no air defense system can reverse. Here is what Washington is doing right now, and why the gap between what is being done and what the situation requires is wider than at any previous point in this conflict. The immediate American response to the IDF logistics strike has followed the established pattern statements of solidarity, condemnation of Iranian aggression consultation with Israeli counterparts' review of available response options. None of that changes the 72-hour clock. The clock does not care about statements. It cares about tonnage, specifically the tonnage of food that reaches IDF frontline units before their carried supply runs out. Israel needs emergency food resupply at a scale and speed that the current operational environment makes extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Let me give you the numbers, because the logistics of the resupply problem are as important as the logistics of the original strike. IDF frontline strength across all active operational sectors is approximately 120,000 personnel. Each soldier requires approximately 3.5 kilograms of food per day to maintain operational effectiveness under combat conditions, a figure that accounts for the caloric demands of physical exertion, cognitive performance, and the metabolic stress of operating in high-threat environments. 120,000 soldiers at 3.5 kilograms per day is 420 tons of food per day. The 90% interdiction of IDF food supply infrastructure means that the IDF's current functional food supply capacity has been reduced to approximately 42 tons per day, enough to sustain approximately 12,000 soldiers at full ration. 18,000 soldiers are operating on carried emergency ration supply that lasts 72 hours. Closing the gap between 42 tons per day and 420 tons per day in 72 hours requires emergency resupply operations at a scale that the current air corridor and ground route situation makes extremely challenging. American military airlift C-17s and C-130s operating from bases in the region can deliver significant tonnage on an emergency basis. But the airlift capacity available in the immediate region operating at maximum sortie rate across a 72-hour window can deliver approximately 200 tons of cargo to Israeli airfields, significantly less than the 420 tons per day required to fully replace the destroyed supply infrastructure. American emergency airlift can partially offset the supply deficit. It cannot close it within the 72-hour window that the operational situation defines as critical. Ground resupply through overland routes from Israeli strategic stockpiles to forward operational areas is constrained by the bridge and road cratering that the Iranian strike executed against primary supply route infrastructure. Secondary routes exist. Their throughput capacity is significantly lower than the primary routes they must replace, and the Iranian UAV inventory retains sufficient operational capacity to target emergency resupply convoys moving through those secondary routes, a threat that Israeli logistics planners must account for in every emergency resupply convoy decision. Washington understands all of this. The Situation Room conversation is not about whether America wants to help. It is about whether America can deliver the specific help that the specific problem requires at the specific speed that the 72-hour clock demands. And the honest answer, the answer that the official statements will never convey, but that the operational mathematics produce, is that American emergency support can slow the degradation timeline. It cannot prevent it entirely within 72 hours. The diplomatic dimension is equally grim. A ceasefire that stops the active military operations would allow IDF logistics to begin reconstituting without the threat of Iranian follow-on strikes against emergency resupply efforts. But the terms of a ceasefire acceptable to Iran at this moment of maximum operational leverage demonstrated by the 72-hour countdown itself, are terms that the Israeli government cannot publicly accept without triggering its own political collapse. Washington is trying to find the diplomatic language that bridges that gap. The 72-hour clock is not waiting for Washington to find it. I want to talk about what happens to soldiers when their food runs out. Not because I want to dwell on the human suffering involved, but because the operational consequences of nutritional deprivation are military facts that belong in any serious analysis of what the 72-hour countdown means. The Israeli frontline soldier is among the most professionally trained, most physically capable, most operationally motivated fighting personnel in the world. The IDF's physical fitness standards, its training regime, its institutional culture of operational excellence, these are genuine achievements that produce genuine military capability. None of that is in question. What is in question is whether those achievements provide immunity against the physiological reality of caloric deprivation under combat conditions. They do not. Nobody does. The human body, under the metabolic stress of active combat operations, continuous physical exertion, sleep deprivation, sustained psychological stress, burns calories at a rate that emergency ration carry loads cannot sustain beyond approximately 72 hours. After 24 hours of reduced ration, fine motor control begins to degrade. After 48 hours, sustained attention and working memory are measurably impaired. After 72 hours, decision-making quality under stress degrades significantly. The cognitive resource that distinguishes experienced professional soldiers from their adversaries begins to erode in ways that training cannot fully compensate for. An IDF unit at the 72-hour mark of food deprivation under combat conditions is not the same military instrument as the same unit at full supply. It is slower. It makes worse decisions under pressure. It is more likely to make errors that cost lives its own and others. And a military force making worse decisions under pressure across multiple active fronts simultaneously is a military force that is losing the operational initiative regardless of the quality of its weapons and the sophistication of its command and control architecture. Iran knows this. The targeting of food supply infrastructure was not arbitrary. It was the selection of the logistics category whose interdiction produces the fastest and most operationally significant degradation of combat effectiveness faster than fuel interdiction, which takes longer to translate into vehicle immobilization, and faster than ammunition interdiction, which requires depletion of carried loads before operational impact is felt. Food is the fastest path from logistics interdiction to combat effectiveness degradation, and Iran chose it deliberately, precisely, and effectively. The will of the Israeli soldier, the genuine, historically demonstrated, operationally proven will of the IDF's frontline personnel to fight under conditions of extraordinary adversity is real and should not be minimized. But will is not a substitute for calories. And the 72-hour clock is counting down against a physiological reality that no amount of institutional commitment or individual courage can indefinitely override. Pull the lens back and look at what this strike means for the global strategic environment, because the targeting of military food supply infrastructure at this scale and effectiveness has implications that extend far beyond the immediate operational situation. The most important strategic signal of this strike is the demonstration that logistics infrastructure, specifically food supply infrastructure, is a viable and highly effective target category for a sophisticated adversary conducting sustained campaign operations against a Western-backed military. This demonstration will be studied by every military in the world that faces a Western-backed adversary and that has been looking for the operational concept that translates available strike capability into decisive operational effect. Russia is drawing immediate lessons for its operational approach in Ukraine. Ukrainian military logistics, food supply, fuel distribution, ammunition resupply are all potential target categories for a Russian strike campaign that has so far focused primarily on energy infrastructure and command nodes. The Iranian demonstration that 90% food supply interdiction can be achieved in a single coordinated strike operation using available air and UAV assets will accelerate Russian consideration of logistics infrastructure as a primary target category. China is conducting a specific analysis of the food supply interdiction concept in the context of Taiwan contingency planning. Taiwan's military logistics, particularly its forward supply infrastructure for the ground forces that would bear the primary burden of a Chinese amphibious assault, is a target set that Chinese operational planning has studied extensively. The Iranian demonstration provides operational validation of a concept that Chinese planners have been developing theoretically. Every military operating a Western-supplied logistics system is this morning updating its logistics vulnerability assessment in light of what Iranian strike planning has demonstrated about the targetability of food supply infrastructure. The specific targeting approach simultaneous strikes against forward depots, distribution hubs, refrigerated storage, and supply route choke points is a template that is platform agnostic. It does not require Su-24s and Iranian UAVs specifically. It requires strike aircraft, precision-guided munitions, and the intelligence to identify the target set. Those requirements are within the reach of multiple potential adversaries of multiple American partners. The global humanitarian dimension of this strike will generate significant international attention and pressure. Targeting military food supply, even military food supply rather than civilian food supply, crosses a threshold in international humanitarian law discourse that will activate advocacy communities, international organizations, and diplomatic pressure in ways that purely military targeting does not. That international pressure will create additional diplomatic complexity for Israel and the United States at a moment when their diplomatic bandwidth is already stretched beyond sustainable capacity. At the deepest strategic level, what Iran has demonstrated tonight is the operational validity of a campaign concept that transforms the nature of military competition against a technologically superior adversary. You do not need to defeat the adversary's weapons. You do not need to break its frontline units in direct combat. You need to break the logistics chain that sustains those units. And you need to break it at the category whose interdiction produces the fastest operational effect. Food is that category, and the 72-hour clock is the proof. Let me bring this to where it must end with the honest assessment that the 72-hour clock demands 50 Su-24s, 500 UAVs, 90% of IDF food supply destroyed.